Hello, today we are going to be talking about geomorphology, which I know is an intimidating sounding word, but when we break it down, it is geo means earth, morph means changing, and ology means the study of. So this is going to be all about the processes that are involved in shaping Earth's landscape, mainly weathering, erosion, and deposition. And we're going to look at two different extreme environments to see how those things can play out. So, weathering, erosion, and deposition. Weathering is breaking down rocks into smaller pieces, into sediments. This can be the size of a boulder or the size of a grain of sand. Sediments can range in size. And typically, weathering is done by water, ice, wind, things like that you're already familiar with. Although there are a lot of different kinds of weathering. There is chemical weathering, which is where you've got acids or things dissolving or oxidation. The substance is changing. There is a chemical reaction occurring. Mechanical weathering is wind blowing things, or heat, or ice, or water washing things away and breaking rocks into sand. And lastly, biological. This could be plant or animal life. If you've ever been walking down the sidewalk and you see tree roots that are making the sidewalk start to break apart, that is biological weathering. There's also something to be aware of called differential weathering. Different kinds of rocks will break apart at different rates. So end up getting really cool looking features that we'll look at in a minute to see how different rocks break down differently. Erosion, then, is those sediments being carried somewhere else. So rivers can erode the side of a mountain by carrying rocks from the mountain somebody else. So weathering is breaking it down, erosion is moving it somewhere, and deposition is dropping it off, is leaving it in a new location. So I mentioned differential weathering. This is an example of how that can happen. This is Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And here in the middle, there was rock that is more difficult to weather. This is sturdier rock. And the softer rock around it eroded. So at some point, all of the land was at this maximum height. But then over time, all of the rock and dirt and sediments on the sides of this tower eroded away, and you were left with just this tower. We can get other interesting features like buttes, which is what Devil's Tower is, and what these kind of large monolithic rocks just standing out in the middle of nowhere are called. Arches, there was softer rock on the inside that eroded away, probably by wind, and left just an arch. And pedestal rocks, where softer rock on the bottom got eroded away, and you can think of the wind blowing sand, and the sand is staying relatively low, and so it is eroding away at the bottom, but at the top you have this rock still just standing there, hanging out. We can also think about how different places weather. So I said that the type of rock matters, but the climate also matters a lot. Specifically, the temperature, the precipitation, how much rain you're getting, those are going to matter a lot for what kind of weathering you'll get. So if I look, for example, if I think about Washington, D.C., has an average yearly temperature of 13 degrees Celsius and an average yearly precipitation of 111 centimeters. So if I look on my graph here at 13 degrees Celsius, 111, it's right about at moderate chemical with some frost action. So remember, chemical weathering, there are going to be chemical changes happening. Frost action, we'll talk about in a second, is a kind of mechanical weathering. But you'll see in colder places or places with not a lot of rain, not a lot of precipitation, you get mostly mechanical weathering. And in warmer places, you get mostly chemical weathering. So frost action, what is that? Frost wedging is a particular kind of weathering that occurs when water freezes in the cracks of rocks. Have you ever been driving over a bridge and you hear that ba-dum, 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 as you go when you're kind of going over these joints? Those are joints in the road put there specifically to avoid this issue. This is a kind of mechanical weathering. Water expands when it freezes. Water gets bigger when it freezes by about 10% of its volume. That expansion, that water freezing and getting bigger is strong enough to break apart solid rock or bridges or whatever if you aren't prepared for it. So when it's warm, water will seep into these cracks of the rock, and then it gets cold and the water freezes, and suddenly you have chunks of rock flying off the side of this butte or whatever it may be. That's why bridges have those little gaps in them or little places filled with rubber so that the water can get in there and expand and not break the bridge. Other kinds of mechanical weathering, you can have wind abrasion. Abrasion is like a cut, essentially, or something being rubbed the wrong way. So wind abrasion is the wind is blowing too hard and breaking off chunks of rock. Water abrasion, same deal. Water abrasion was likely what caused this feature, and you'll see this a lot around islands where you have kind of something just standing out in the middle, a little formation and surrounded by water. Running water, in fact, causes the most weathering of and erosion anywhere on Earth. Water is really good at breaking rocks down and moving rocks somewhere else. Waves also are kind of considered different than running water often. This is what creates beaches and caves. The waves continually breaking over and over the same sediments. That's why you often have really small grains of sand on the beach. And another kind of mechanical weathering are mass movements, like landslides. So this is, landslides, mudslides, avalanche, all of those fall into the same category of mass movements. These occur because of the steepness of a slope and instability due to water. So when water gets in there and freezes, it can break things up, make a slope unstable, and are triggered most often by gravity, but mass movements, landslides, mudslides can also be triggered by volcanoes, earthquakes, human activities, the weather, lots of things. So mass movements are just these huge movements of sediment and rock as they slide down. And this can be really slow sometimes. This is a picture of the Slumgillian earth flow in Colorado. This moves 7 meters a year, or about 23 feet a year. So this is a rock slide. These rocks are moving down the side of the mountains in Colorado, just not quite the terrifying, horrific mudslide or avalanche that you think of in a disaster movie. We can see evidence of the Slumgillian earth flow. Also, this is a lake that naturally formed as a result of the movement. Lake San Cristobal formed when this earth flow, this mass movement, slowly eventually blocked off a river, and then you have a lake. Other mass movements happen pretty quickly. A avalanche, like you think of in a disaster movie, like in Mulan, there's some human activity causing a mass movement. Avalanches on the sides of snowy mountains are an example of this kind of mass movement, which is mechanical weathering. And we can see evidence for some of these avalanches on the side of mountains. You can see places where the trees have disappeared because there was suddenly a landslide here. We can also see some of the scars left behind, patches of dirt where there are no longer trees. There is a piece carved out in the middle where an avalanche happened. So those are all mechanical weathering. Chemical weathering, like I said, is when there is some kind of chemical reaction occurring. So when you've got acid rain, when rust forms or oxidation happens, salinization, which is salt mixing with things and can really wreak havoc on environments. They are changes to the molecular structure of soil, of sediments, of the rock, whatever it is. You can get caves forming this way often. You can see there are lots of salt crystals here, so evidence of that kind of change happening. And a great way to kind of see all of this in action and see is, like I said, some extreme environments. So first, today we're going to look at deserts. Deserts are large, arid regions where there's less than 10 inches of rain a year. They can be sandy plains, they can be mountain tundras, frozen subarctic ice sheets, rocky regions. I know when you think of a desert, you probably think of the Sahara or something like that, where it's just great big sand, nothing anywhere. Antarctica is a desert. There are deserts in the US. There are mountain deserts. Most of Australia is a desert. These are just places where they get less than 10 inches of rain a year. So, how do weathering and erosion look in a desert? Well, water is the cause of most of the erosion, which remember is the moving of sediments in deserts, usually because of flash floods. It doesn't rain often in deserts, less than 10 inches a year, but when it does, it is fast and it is heavy. So this is showing up all of a sudden, flash floods carrying things away. And erosion can be a huge problem in deserts because of a lack of vegetation. So you maybe sometimes see on the side of a hill, there are lots of trees or plants there. That is to prevent erosion. The roots of plants are really good at holding soil in place. In a desert, there's not a whole lot of vegetation, so there aren't a whole lot of roots to hold the soil in place, so you get a lot of erosion. The soil is also very loose. It's very dry. Things aren't compact like clay. And the rates of chemical weathering are decreased because of this lack of moisture. Remember, I showed on that chart before that rainy areas tend to have the most chemical weathering, and because of the lack of organic acids due to scarce plant life. Deserts don't have the acids needed to do the chemical reactions because there aren't plants producing those acids. So there's not a whole lot of weathering going on, not a whole lot of stuff being broken down. If there is, it is mostly by wind. But there is a whole lot of erosion. Erosion is a big problem. Water is the cause because of these flash floods, and it's because the soil isn't being held together by anything. So we can see lots of interesting desert features when we look. There are things called playa lakes, which are small lakes that form during a flash flood. They typically don't last for very long, and they leave behind cracks of salt. So you might sometimes see like a salt plain where you've got just like chunks of cracked salt. That was at one point a lake in the middle of a desert. An alluvial fan is a large fan-shaped deposit at the mouth of a canyon. So here, this is a salt plain left behind from a playa. An alluvial plain, here there was a desert canyon and water was flowing down, and the water was carrying sediments with it. So as soon as the water flowing down out of this canyon made it out and was able to spread out, all of the sediments that the water was carrying also spread out with it in this alluvial fan shape. And probably the most well-known desert feature are the dunes, sand dunes. These are wind-blown sand, piles of sand, and they move. Sand dunes can migrate up to 15 meters a year. That's like 45, 50 feet. They move in a year. They are not random piles, but in fact, they are pretty consistent, and they are based on the wind direction, which way is the wind blowing consistently, the wind velocity, the abundance of sand, and the kind of vegetation present. So there are 5 main kinds of dunes to be familiar with. The Barcan dunes are the first. They are crescent shapes where the tips point downwind. So in all of these pictures, there's going to be a blue arrow. That blue arrow is showing you the direction of the wind. So a consistent wind in a place with limited sand and not a whole lot of vegetation will form these curved dunes where the tips are pointing in the direction of the wind. They are following the wind. And you can see it's this nice curve with a smooth slope, and it falls down steeply at the end. This is actually a picture of dunes on Mars, where, again, limited sand and not a whole lot of vegetation. Transverse dunes are these huge, long ripples that form perpendicular to the wind. They form in areas with lots of sand and not a whole lot of vegetation. These can get really tall. This picture is very zoomed out or from far away. These can be 200 meters tall and a kilometer or a couple kilometers across. Oftentimes, transverse dunes will fade into Barken dunes or vice versa because they both form in areas with not a whole lot of vegetation and sand moves. The amount of sand available at any time can vary, so we can go back and forth between these two often. Longitudinal dunes are these long ridges that form when two winds are kind of converging and coming together and pushing up sand in these little hills. Again, areas with not a whole lot of sand. Then there are parabolic dunes. These are backwards from the first one. They are also crescent shaped, but the points point to the direction of the wind. So the wind is coming in this way, and the tips of the crescent point towards the wind. These form in areas where the sand is a little bit more wet and where there is more vegetation. So this is the kind of dune that you will most often see at a beach. And the last is a star dune. These are a little bit more complex. You've got lots of winds coming from lots of directions that form little peaks, little hills. These are the kinds of dunes that you typically find in the Sahara Desert, where the wind is changing directions a lot. And again, these can get really tall. These can be 50 meters or more. So here are all of the dunes together: the Barken dunes, linear or longitudinal dunes, transverse dunes, parabolic, which are often by the beach, and like I said, the Barken dunes that can kind of become transverse or vice versa, and the star dunes. So there is what you need to know about weathering, erosion, and how those two can have an effect on deserts and how we see how they play out in a desert and the different features that they can create in a desert. The next notes video will be about how weathering and erosion play out with glaciers and how that extreme environment can create lots of different interesting features as well. After this, you've got a lab where you're going to see how different kinds of weathering and erosion work in different areas, and we will pick up with glaciers next time. Bye-bye.